Welcome, everyone. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook and Instagram, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow us at Reading by Third, and on LinkedIn, follow us at Campaign for GLR. Once again, welcome, everyone. My name is Leah Cruz, and I will be behind the scenes helping produce the conversation today. First, I would like to take a moment to thank our funders. We want to acknowledge our enterprise and programmatic funders, as well as our individual donors. Your support not only helps us hold these vital conversations, but it also helps us create meaningful opportunities to share insights, foster connections, and build the CGLR community. So thank you. A few housekeeping tips before we get started. So we would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. Go ahead and let us know your name and where you're joining us from, city, state, or organization, and be sure to select everyone so that we know who is here. Also, you can share your thoughts throughout the webinar in the chat box, but you are in listen-only mode, and we encourage your engagement in the chat box as well as the Q&A box, where you can actually ask direct questions directly to our panelists, and we will try to get those questions answered throughout the webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording, as well as the slides, the bios, and any resources mentioned during the webinar or in our chat will be shared on Friday of this week in a follow-up to everyone who's registered. And lastly, we will have a brief on-screen evaluation during the Q&A at the end portion of the webinar, rather, and we highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And there will be a link to fill out that survey earlier in the webinar, dropped in the chat if you have to jump off early. So just be on the lookout for that. We really do appreciate and use your feedback on these sessions. A few of our upcoming webinars we just wanted to let you know about before we get started. So the follow-on to this conversation will be next week. More Hopeful Futures or Children's Collateral Damage Part 2 will be about the potential implications of accelerated deportation and how that is affecting youth and families. We will also do another in our Decoding NAEP series the following Tuesday with educators. So we'll have some educators to reflect on learning recovery and the results of NAEP. And we'll have a funder to funder about actually advancing early math, and that will be on Tuesday the 15th, and that's a 12:30 session. And we'll have another follow-on conversation on the science of reading on April 15th. So that is with CLI on the 15th. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to John Gompertz, who is Executive Fellow with Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and he is going to be our fearless leader in this conversation today.
Thanks, Leah, and hello, friends. Thanks for joining. We've got a lot to talk about today, so I'm glad and I'm grateful that you're here. We planned this session a few weeks ago, and a couple times we wondered, is there actually going to be any real action for us to talk about? Well, I think we've got that problem solved. Maybe you know that Bonnie Raitt lyric. Let's give them something to talk about. Well, yeah, some folks have really given us plenty to talk about today. Now, so often, those of us who work on issues related to kids and education, we find it hard to get our issues in the news. And then when they do make the news, they're relegated to the local pages or even the society pages. Well, we don't have that to worry about right now either. Education policy, education funding, it's on the front pages right now. And it's day after day. But much of what's being covered on those front page stories is what I would put in the category of political theater. And I think you know by now, these webinars are not the place for commentary on political theater. We can find plenty of that commentary in our favorite publications, newscasts, podcasts, social media channels. So we won't spend any time on that stuff today. Maybe you'll recall that when we launched our series on NAEP a few weeks ago, we started with a session that went quote unquote, behind and beyond the headlines. And today's session has that same spirit and flavor about what we're reading about in the news and hearing about in the news. We aim to get specific about what's at stake in the already taken actions and the proposed changes to the Department of Education and the federal investment in education. Two final thoughts about this conversation before I introduce our guests and we get into it. One, I said we're not going to focus on political theater. Here's what we are going to focus on. What does this mean for kids? Which kids? Where? How? And two, to help myself and maybe all of us, I am going to channel my inner sort of dumb guy. I'm going to start at the beginning with this conversation. What is the federal role in education? When did it start? Why? Why do we have this? And then we're going to dig into some of the specific elements of the federal role in education. Again, trying to understand from the bottom up what is the background, which kids, what roles, what families are being served and supported through the federal investment in education. By the way, I should mention, we're going to continue the exploration of these issues next week with a session that focuses on questions related to the impacts on immigrant families. So I hope you'll tune in for that. And as always, I think you can find a link to that in the chat box. So whatever each of our position or positions might be about what is happening in the Department of Education, and to the federal investment in education, I think it'll serve all of us well to really understand what we and others are talking about, to be informed, and to be able to discuss these issues with a level of accuracy and specificity. That's, I think, part of the leadership role of the folks in this network. That's the part of the role that we all play with the people who we interact with. As this conversation proceeds, I hope you'll tell us what more you want to know. Put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll endeavor to get to them to the best of our abilities. Now, we have the perfect set of guests to help us with our mission today. I'm going to give you a short bio of each guest, and as always, we'll put a link to the full bios in the chat box. So, Amalia Chamorro leads education policy for Unidos US, which was formerly the National Council of La Raza, the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization. Bob Cunningham is the past CEO and current director of policy engagement for the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children and a principal consultant at 21st Century Minds. Denise Fort is the president and CEO of Education Trust. You know, people who host podcasts often call frequent guests friends of the pod. Well, Denise Fort is the ultimate friend of Learning Tuesdays and the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and we appreciate it. Lindsay Jones is the Chief Executive Officer of CAST, where she works with innovative educators and researchers across the globe to design education systems that are learner-centric, flexible, accessible, and rooted in the universal design for learning. Now, full disclosure about Elson Nash. Elson Nash is a delightful former colleague of mine at the Corporation for National and Community Service. But Elson graduated from working there and hanging around with guys like me, and he went on to leadership positions at the Department of Education, and he now spearheads strategic partnerships for the Education Commission of the States. And finally, Leslie Villegas is a senior policy analyst with the Education Policy Program at New America, and she focuses specifically on pre-K through 12 policy landscape for English language learners. So that's an all-star cast, and it's a big one. So let's get to it, starting with asking Denise to give us some background on the federal role in education. Denise, can you come on screen?
Here I am. Can you see me?
I
Sensing me?
can.
Anybody?
I can. And thank you so much for joining us. The ultimate friend of the of Learning Tuesday.
I'm so glad you gave me that title. It's almost better than president and CEO.
Some days I bet it is. Having been a president and CEO, I bet some days it is. Okay, so you lead Education Trust. And but as you know, I'd like to kick this off with asking you to play a slightly different role today. I'm going to ask you to be professor for it and to take us to school a little on the history of the federal role in education policy and funding. So as I understand it, the first federal role in education came like in 1867, right after the Civil War. What was that about?
Yeah, John, thank you so much for that great opening, and I'm always so glad to be here with you. You know, I have served as an education policy advocate and public servant my entire professional career. And while I'm no history major, my history major husband will tell you that. I do think I know a little bit about education. So I'm excited to share with you, and you kicked us off with the right question. Um, Created in 1867, right after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, a time when the nation was trying to rebuild itself,
Yeah.
extend rights to Black Americans. And the goal at that time was super simple, but really powerful. And to collect data and statistics across states. Um, does that sound familiar to anybody? Uh,
Imagine.
Imagine, uh, it exists in some shape or form as the National Center for Education Statistics. But collecting data and statistics, this just resonates with me because underneath that, at least for a moment, there was the belief that education could be a tool itself for transformation. But like many things, the federal commitment to equity was pretty fragile. The early vision didn't last. Just about a year later, the Department of Education was downgraded. Not so because education wasn't important at that time, but because of the idea the federal government was getting too involved in local education. And perhaps it meant supporting a grander role in education for more children, and that made people uncomfortable. So it's a pattern we see again and again in American history. When federal power is used to expand opportunity, there's often very, very fierce resistance and also framed as a fight for local control.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So the next giant signal event really happened a whole century later with the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965. And the next President Johnson, have advanced from, uh, the first President Johnson to Lyndon Baines Johnson. And many things have happened. We've had much more universal education, universal high school, and so forth. In the meantime, we've had the GI Bill. A lot of things have happened, but in 1965, we get ESEA, which is the next big signal event. Give us a little bit of what ESEA was all about and why it was so important.
Um, you know, it was a time where the federal government, the New Deal, um, very much linked to the civil rights movement.
Yep.
It was really the first time the federal government wasn't just going to collect data, it was going to put real money on the table, and also, have a role to play in educational justice. Title I, perhaps the most signature and enduring title of ESAA, it wasn't charity. It was about unfair system. It was an attempt to correct that system, one that punished children for too long for being born into poverty or attending other under-resourced schools. Um, and it was a time when the country was finally confronting racial injustice in voting and public accommodations. At that time, ESCA added a third pillar, education is a civil right and should remain one. And it's really a moment when the federal government said, we see the inequities, we're gonna put dollars to that and enforcement to that.
So, Denise, a lot of those civil rights measures enacted in the 60s were hard fought, close calls. Was that the case with ESEA, or did ESEA actually reflect a national consensus that the time had come for the federal government to play a more active role in education?
Well, you know, the federal government was investing more in both K through 12 and higher education programs.
Mhm.
There was a growing public consensus that education deserved focused, high-level leadership. And, again, at that time where there was a demand and a need for stronger oversight and civil rights enforcement in schools.
Mhm.
This was the time when the federal government really showed up. And that's significant. It's really significant because they wanted states to start complying with federal civil rights laws, and they made ESCA in that fashion.
Gotcha. Gotcha. That's super helpful. So we're going to pass over for the moment, Denise, the legislation in 1975 to support kids with special learning needs, because Lindsay and Bob are going to talk about that in a second. So let's go to 1979, 1980, when the Department of Education was established. What led to this? And what did it change about education programs that they were now housed in a separate department instead of being administered inside of that cabinet agency that used to be called HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare?
Yeah, and that's, it had moved into different places, but at that point it was in HEW. But by that time, by the 80s, education was really too important and getting a little complex, right? I mean, you mentioned 1975 IDEA, lots of things going on. It was way too important to be a side operation within a massive social service agency. And so, growing public consensus said education deserves some focus, deserved high level leadership. And that meant elevating education to where it belongs, uh, the heart of national priorities. And a lot of that meant, this wasn't just a bureaucratic change, it was a statement of values. The creation of the department signaled that public education wasn't just a local or state concern,
Yeah.
and that there were places where you needed a backstop, and that's where the federal government came in as a backstop to start to, even out some of the unevenness across the country, and even out some of the injustices or bring justice to those areas that needed it.
So I know it's a lot to fast forward 40x years, 45 years from 1980 to today, but tell us some of what you think what are the signal activities during that time on the legal side. We had No Child Left Behind, we had Race to the Top, we had Give us a little bit of a thumbnail of how we got from 1980 to 2025.
Well, as it would happen, someone said, indeed, President Reagan said, the Department of Education was an example of federal overreach, and he wanted it gone. Um, so that sounds familiar as well.
Yep.
However, you know, um, it still, he failed at that. Folks weren't about that because now there was a greater understanding that, the department did have a role to play. It was providing many, many dollars. It was reinforcing, it was setting up some new but limited accountability and assessment structures, sort of the precursor to No Child Left Behind.
Yep.
And I think there was also because we now had or continue to have this data and statistics arm that was being shared widely, more people were starting to see that the federal role was having some impact in some states, but there was still some unevenness. And then along comes President Bush, um, with the big four of Senator Kennedy, my
Yeah.
former boss, George Miller, John Boehner, a future speaker, and Senator Gregg from New Hampshire, um, who came together because, you know, George Bush had already shown that if you follow the data and then intervene, you could make something happen. And George Miller, being a huge data guy, said, I'm going to go hear more from this guy. But there was really an understanding that we needed greater accountability. We need to make sure that all kids were held to the highest standard possible. Now, look, I was there on Capitol Hill at the time, and I can say, alongside a few others, it didn't get everything right, had flaws, but it really marked a milestone.
It was really remarkable that after this tension between federal and local control, how much George W. Bush really leaned into the federal role in education. You know, if we go back and talk about science of reading and how reading gets taught, I mean, he really leaned into all that stuff. It didn't entirely work, as you said, and there were some distortions as always, but this was a remarkable moment in which a Republican president, who at the time was thought to be a pretty conservative Republican president, really leaned into the role of the Department of Education, put some of his most trusted advisors in charge and so forth. So that's really
It
interesting.
was the greatest expansion in the federal role, right? It
Yeah.
really was.
That's so fascinating. Okay, so we get to President Obama and then President Trump and President Biden. Give us just a quick snapshot of what's happened more recently, and then we're gonna
Yeah.
into
Very quickly, the
yeah.
boomerang effect, as we expect. Right? Uh, Too much federal involvement. States wanted more flexibility. And ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which
Yeah.
replaced No Child Left Behind, was centered on that. Um, Trying to keep some key equity principles like disaggregated data, school improvement, accountability. But again, I think there was a overcorrection there.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And we've seen a couple of very large expansions of federal investment. One at the beginning of the Obama administration with the investments to get out of the recession, the Great Recession,
Right.
and then second during both the end of President Trump's first term and President Biden's term as part of the plan to get out of the COVID recession, right?
Yeah, yep.
So
Uh,
lots more money. When you and I probably started in this game, we'd say something like 7% of education spending was federal, but that percentage actually went up, right?
oh yeah. I mean, at different times, just like you pointed out, during the housing crisis and then during the pandemic, significant investment in both K-12 and higher ed.
Mhm.
Uh, but they all end sooner than everyone expected. And so that's why we're seeing some challenges in the states around their own funding of education.
Yeah. Okay, Denise, spectacular job. You can tell your husband that you crushed. Or tell him I said so anyhow. And stick around. We're going to come back to you in a little while, but now we're going to go to Lindsay and Bob. to join us to talk a little bit about the various pieces of legislation that Congress has passed to support young people with special needs. So, Lindsay, thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John.
Of course, it's great to see you. Thank you. Look, in the vein of and in the context of what Denise just did for us, can you explain a little bit of the history of the federal engagement around kids with special needs, 1975, and then again later? What were these laws and these investments?
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to disability rights and students with special learning needs, one of the most critical things to understand is the history, because especially with IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act,
Yep.
that law is completely designed in response to the parent and advocate outcry for equitable and better treatment for students with disabilities. So prior to 1975, lots of people, well, lots of states around the nation had laws prohibiting, essentially prohibiting students with disabilities from attending public schools. And these were routinely upheld in the courts. Parents and advocates started pushing back and saying, really pushing for a transformation in the education system, saying variability is the norm. That's what I would say, right? We need to educate all of our students. And there's a core purpose, which is, if you're a parent, I know you're a parent, right? I know your daughter, one of them. And I know that, one of the key focuses for parents is the whole lifetime of their child, right? They don't think about just K-12 or just pre-K. So as parents were fighting, there were two major lawsuits that came to the Supreme Court. They came in 1973, and they basically, the opinions merge and basically form what still remains the core of our nation's parent and student rights law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So that law, everything about it is about making sure schools find students with disabilities and proactively serve them. There is a requirement in it called child find, right?
Wow.
Yeah, that is what it's about. It's like, we know that there's a history of prohibiting and exclusion, and so you've got to find students. Also, a key point is funding. In both of those Supreme Court cases, the government made the case that it was too expensive to fund students with disabilities in education. And that failed the constitutional argument, but it sits in IDEA, which is a grant to states. The federal government grants funding for students with disabilities to states. All states opt into this. And so they receive funds. And in the core part of the law is this, in DC, we've all heard of it, I think maybe too much, right? Full funding for IDEA. And that's because Congress included a provision that said the federal government will provide 40% of the excess cost to fund the education of students with disabilities. Congress has never done that. They've never met the 40%. We're currently at about 10. The highest was under one of the periods that Denise just talked about with George W. Bush. The highest, it was 18.5%. But that's why this law is about parent rights, student rights. It gives parents the rights to come into a meeting, to know what's happening with their student. And it's the only federal education law that gives parents a private right of action. And that is the ability to contest the public school's decision about what they are offering to do to educate their student.
Wow. Lindsay, what the money, the 18.5%, how does that flow to states? Can you describe? Is that in a block grant or is it competitive? How does that money go to states?
It's not competitive. Every state gets it. It's basically based on population. There are varying formulas.
It's a formula.
It's a formula grant, yes. And
Okay. But it's never been fully funded up to 40% of the cost of educating a student with special needs.
Right. No. So that basically what they're saying is if your state's paying a per pupil cost for every kid, we estimate of 40%, there'll be more needed to fund the special education. And that's what the federal department is supposed to come in to provide. It's never reached, its highest point was about 18.5% under former President Bush.
Okay, interesting. Bob, thanks for joining us, Bob. Can you bring us all the way down to the ground level? How does support, Lindsay's talking about big numbers. How does support for IDEA trickle down in practical ways to children and families? What does it do for them?
Pretty much everything, right? It's not this along with ESSA, this defines kids and families' experiences in schools, right? So these two laws basically come together and really define it. So like Lindsay just said, when parents think that something is going on with their child, that there might be some sort of disability here, or even if parents don't think, it is in fact an affirmative responsibility of the district to identify children who have disabilities. So if you're a parent and your child is struggling in school and somebody at the school thinks that your child might have a disability, or you think that your child might have a disability, or somebody that you know says, hey, do you think maybe your child has a disability? Then you have the ability to go and ask for an evaluation. And the school district has a responsibility under most circumstances to conduct that evaluation and then to figure out whether your child has a disability, and if they do, whether they need special education and related services and accommodations because of that disability. And if they do, then the school has a responsibility to create an individualized education plan for your child and set out goals and those kinds of things. And that works with the idea that parents need to be, or families need to be, actively engaged in their children's education, and that's consistent between ESSA and the IDEA. And so that idea of parental involvement, the idea of high expectations, right? So Lindsay mentioned kids were kind of prohibited from being at public schools. It went 180 degrees from there. There's now a law that says we have to have high expectations for learners with disabilities. So communication, expectations, information, the amount of information that needs to be provided to families, all of that. And for a child, it's all about what you need to have equal access. What do you need to be able to access the same curriculum that other students access? What do you need to be able to be successful in that public school? So the answer to your question is it doesn't trickle down, it surrounds, it lifts up. That's what it does.
For both of you, I have two questions now around the proposed changes. Are there proposed changes to IDEA that have to do with the level of funding and the kinds of supports and rights that parents have under IDEA? Anything that this administration has suggested that would suggest that would indicate a change in those rights or the funding?
No, we have not seen them propose to change the legislation IDEA. Congress would have to do that.
Right.
Congress would also have to change the authorization levels. What we've seen is Secretary McMahon testified that, and it's been widely reported, that they might want to move the department to the Department of, to the HHS. But I think, John, one of the critical things is that for, just as Bob said, for students with disabilities, they're general education students first. So changes to ESSA, changes to other ways that we are managing general education absolutely impact them. I think you would find every special ed teacher in this nation would say, before 2001, when No Child Left Behind was passed and Low Child Left Behind had its requirement that we test 95% of each subgroup, For kids with disabilities, that was transformational because it was the first time many special ed teachers will tell you that a principal walked into their classroom and thought about how are you providing education to the student. So I just want to make the point that it isn't just IDEA that wraps around the student. It's our general education law as well.
Yeah, yeah, I get that. They're intertwined. And that's really important. Bob, I want to let me, Lindsay alluded to this suggestion that maybe administration of IDEA would shift to HHS. Does that matter?
Yeah, it matters because
Say why.
there's a lack of I'm going to go out on a limb and say there's most likely a lack of specific expertise at HHS that you would find at the current Department of Education. There's also the danger of fragmentation, right? So if you split things up into different agencies, then that tight relationship between IDEA and between special education, the Office of Civil Rights, the general education laws of the land, right? We've spent now 50 years or so building up a system that is fairly integrated and works kind of together, not perfectly, of course, but works together. So the danger is in fragmenting that. Kids are going to fall through the cracks. So, you know, I also really have a concern, particularly with HHS, because they're responsible for health, right? Obviously, and we've come a long way from looking at disabilities through that very, very tight medical lens, and the idea that all that is encompassed by having a learning disability or other kinds of disabilities is a deficit, and we know that's not true.
Yeah.
So the question is, how will a medically oriented agency or department really kind of focus on the other aspects of disabilities, educational disabilities, disabilities in schools, that sort of thing. So I feel like there's a danger there as well.
I understood. You know, your answer prompts me to ask you back to my inner dumb guy. Like in the law and in practice, what is the definition of a quote unquote disability? What kids are we talking about here, actually? Either one of you or both of you.
Go ahead, Jones. Take all 13 of them.
Right. So under so this is a great question. Under IDEA, there are 13 categories of disability.
Yikes.
There are 13. And there are other federal laws, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which was passed in 1973, the Americans with Disabilities Act. But in harmony, they do work to help understand how our legal framework applies to individuals with disabilities in school, in healthcare, in work, all throughout their life. But I just want to emphasize Bob's point, which was excellent. We have spent 50 years moving away from the idea that disability is a disease, and that ESSA and IDEA are important in working together. And that is a concern. And I think parents and others should be concerned and should ask informed questions as we consider a move to this agency. What message does it send to our children with disabilities, our children with dyslexia, dyscalculia, right? Math, reading, all types of disabilities, in addition to cerebral palsy. People are whole people. And so we just need to attend to that as we consider all of the possible policy implications.
Bob, you want to add on to what Lindsay said? Or you good with her answer?
I'd never want to argue with Lindsay. No, I'm completely good with what she said. I think, you know, we talked about money earlier. I have to say this for everyone. This is kind of a, you know, fun fact, right? So the budget of our federal government is twice the combined budget of all states, right? So when you think about that, the flow of money really is what kind of allows everything to be done as smoothly as possible. We know it's not smooth, but that's what allows it to be done as smoothly as possible. So my other concern with all of these changes is So we know that Congress is responsible for the purse strings, right? So we know that Congress is going to allocate budget. Right now, that money largely flows through the Department of Education. So you're going to divide that up as well. And so when it comes to impact on kids and families, we rely on the Department of Ed. We rely on the Office of Civil Rights for the right of action that Lindsay talked about, right? We rely on the Department of Ed for ensuring that the money that is allocated is spent according to the purpose of the allocation. And we have a long history in this country of localities not spending the money for the intended purposes. If I'm a principal and I was one, right? If I'm a teacher and I was one, I have to react to what's going on right now. And if there is a safety concern at my school, I might take that aide that paraprofessional that's supposed to be working in special education. I might apply them to another function within the school because in my mind, my priority is that. Like we have to have some level of protection, whether it's at the state or federal levels, to make sure that those funds are allocated appropriately, no matter what changes are done. So that's my last kind of pitch for how this impacts kids and families.
Fantastic. That was terrific. And I want to come back to you when we get to more general questions. So thank you both for that. That was really a great briefing. Now, Amalia and Leslie, can you come on camera and join? Thanks so much for being here today. Really appreciate it. Amalia, can you do a little explanation of the history of Title III legislation? How is it connected to the civil rights movement? You know, give us a little, you've seen what people have done here. Do a little bit of that for Title III, please.
All right, tough act to follow, but I'll try. All right, so Title III, which is also known as the English Language Acquisition Grant Program, is described in Title III, Part A of the Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, which is the overarching K-12 federal law on education. This was reauthorized in NCLB, No Child Left Behind Act in 2002, and then again, most recently, as Denise shared, in the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015. So it's been about 10 years since the last reauthorization. Important to highlight that Title III is the primary federal program dedicated to helping English learners attain English language proficiency so that they're able to meet the same challenging academic standards as their peers. Also, all states do receive Title III funds through a formula that basically takes into account the number of a state's immigrant and English learner students. So it is distributed to each state under this formula. And then the state then distributes the funds to local school districts to be able to support their provision of language, academic content instruction, all evidence-based, also to support professional development, since most teachers will experience having an English learner in their classroom at some time, and also to support family engagement opportunities for parents of English learner students. So that's, you know, just encapsulating what is Title III and how the grant provides supports to states and schools to support their English learner students.
So, Leslie, let me bring you in here. Can you do, we just heard about 13 categories of disabilities of people who are covered under IDEA. Who can you explain who Title III is designed to serve? You know, when we say English learners, what do we actually mean?
Sure, definitely. It is a hard question to answer because Title III serves roughly 5.3 million students classified as English learners nationwide. And a common misconception about this population is that they're all foreign born, but in reality, 72% are US citizens. And I think this is an important fact to keep in mind as we talk about the impact that eliminating the Department of Education will have on linguistically diverse students, because they are both foreign born and US born. And another kind of important fact to think about with this population is that a third of US children ages 0 to 5 are dual language learners, meaning that they are learning 2 languages at the same time. And again, a big misconception about the English learner population is that the majority of them are older and recent arrivals, and the data and the demographics just show that that's not the case. English learners are, they are enrolled in schools across the country. They live in every single state, and they are racially diverse. The top 4 races are, or in 2021 were Hispanic, Latino, followed by Asian and Asian, or like Asian American, Pacific Islanders, white and Black and African American. So, again, another misconception is that they're all Spanish speaking Latinos, and that's not the case. They come from very diverse backgrounds. They speak over 283 languages. And now, just to list the top 10, it's Spanish, Arabic, English, Chinese, Vietnamese, Portuguese, Hmong, Haitian Creole, Russian, and Somali. So that's very linguistically diverse. That is who Title III serves.
Gotcha. Now, 5.3 million, 33%, those are giant numbers, right? But help me connect up how much we're spending. Like, if you're a kid in South Dakota and you're an English language learner and South Dakota is getting some of this formula money, like how much of what you're getting in school is actually funded or supported in some way by this federal investment?
Yeah, so the most recent Title III appropriation for 2025 was $890 million for the entire country. As Amalia mentioned, each state gets a portion of this pot of money depending on how many English learners and immigrant children and youth are enrolled. I actually do have the number or the figure for South Dakota if you'd like it.
Go ahead. Just as an example.
Yeah, in South Dakota, it was 925,000. 288. That was in 2024.
Okay.
And that's on the low end though. So, Montana, Vermont, Wyoming, they receive a minimum of 500,000. And then on the high end, you have, Texas and California receiving upwards of 140 million. But the majority of states kind of fall in that range of like of 1 to 20 million. Yeah.
So, those numbers are actually comparatively small compared to the numbers of students you named, and the percentage of the student population. Amalia, back to you. Can you go back over a second so what do these funds actually pay for? Like, how does this help English learners?
Yeah, for sure. And I just wanted to underscore, Leslie shared in terms of like the funding levels to support English learners through Title III. When you break down the 890 million across the nation for the 5.3 million EL students, I mean, per pupil, that's only about $168.
Yeah, so it's right. This is what I'm getting
Right.
at. Like, are we
Right.
getting agitated about something that is actually really small? But I think what you're about to tell us is this money, how the money is being spent and why it matters.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. And so it does Title III, right? It's not a whole ton of money, but it provides critical supplemental support to states who have made insufficient, investments and do have limited funds to be able to, tailor support that specifically for the EL population. So
Yeah.
Title III helps states, school districts be able to provide also for national professional development grants, which are also awarded to institutions of higher education to provide for professional development activities to help educators improve instruction for ELs. The Title III funds can also be utilized to support family engagement coordination support, for example, because it's so important for the families of English learners to be able to interact, have meaningful engagement, be able to communicate with school staff so that they can also become an integral part of their child's education and trajectory, and having that connection with a coordinator that may speak their language, right? May have, be able to provide for various cultural diversity can come a long way to be able to bring the family into the school environment as well.
Terrific, terrific. Thanks to both of you. Stick around, we're coming back to you shortly, but that was a great little briefing on what Title III is all about. Elson, can you join us now for a second?
Hello
Hey,
there.
Hey, my friend, nice to see you. Thanks for
Good
joining.
to see you. Yes.
So, Elson, you have an interesting perspective. You worked for the Department of Education, and now you work for the states. And a
Yeah.
lot of people think that the proposed changes would potentially benefit states because of increased oversight, increased flexibility, and decreased oversight. So, how do you square up those questions?
Yeah, it's complicated, first and foremost.
Isn't it, right?
Very complicated. Denise gave a great overview of the history of education, and how the pendulum has swung back and forth.
Sure.
With anything, they need guardrails. States need guardrails. And equally important, states need support in order to effectively administer the funds and to target the funds. And so for many years, we at the department have had plans, we've had oversight, we've had protections from OCR and Office of General Counsel. So imagine a world where those protections, oversight, research, and accountability are not there. And that's a scary world. Even for states who say that they want those funds. There's got to be guardrails available. There's got to be data supporting accountability available. There's got to be TA available. And so those are critical issues that make this a complicated enterprise.
Yeah, I get that. So talk a little, let's start a little bit with where Denise started us with data. We had last week's webinar was 5 fantastic state chiefs from really, all over the country and all over the map, also ideologically, red state, purple state, blue state, all of that. A lot of unanimity around the importance of NAEP and federal research and benchmarking. They had some gripes with NAEP, like we get some more flexibility and this and that and the other thing. Talk about states and how the interaction, because states all have their own assessment thing. So
They do.
Why isn't that good enough?
Yeah, I mean, once again, this idea of having a roadmap, having a nationwide evidence-based clearinghouse of information. In terms of NAEP and other stories, the ability to understand what benchmarking is. That's the beauty of having a centralized system. When you start decentralizing it, and yes, sure, we would like flexibilities in our states, but when you have a national benchmark, a national understanding of where you're going, it helps you to push harder. When you think about international standards at OECD, it gives you an idea of where we are in relation to other countries. If we don't have that, we're kind of all over the map. And so that is the beauty of having national data. That is the beauty of having national research around effectiveness and evidence-based practices, because it gives us the benchmarks needed across our country.
Okay, I get that. That makes sense. You talked a little about TA, also. What does TA look like for states right now? And what is
Yeah.
it the states would like to, you think, keep? And what is it you think the states would be like, yeah, you could just put that money in a box and send it to us. We'll take care of it.
Well, currently, there was the regional education labs
Yeah.
to the tune of about 336 million, and the comprehensive centers to the tune of about 226 million. Those contracts were basically eliminated.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about eliminating the necessary technical assistance for large states, but probably even more important, small states, rural states that don't have the budgets to do it on their own. And that's what's key about utilizing the supports of regional education labs and comprehensive centers, because they provided supports for those small states, those rural states that may not have the big budgets that could do it on their own. So some folks can do it on their own. Some folks have done it on their own. But in order to have the type of supports needed, once again, across the board, that's why having these types of technical assistance available were critically important. So I'll stop there on that one.
All right. Well, that's helpful. But let me ask you this other question. I mean, a lot of what's getting talked about is, we're going to have the same amount of money. We're just going to block grant it, right? And every state. Now, let's say that happens, because that seems like it could happen, right? Well, the money that was discussed earlier is not exactly it's not exactly block granted, but it's kind of, it goes by formula and then states administer it. And which is also true of a lot of Title I money, right? X number of dollars, you could tell me what, stuck in Washington, stayed in Washington, right? For all the people who worked at the Department of Education and did the things that they do. Will states get that money that used to stick in Washington and to help administer these things, or are they going to be overwhelmed by, oh, here's a box with really a lot of money in it, but I don't even have the people to do this? How's that?
That's the challenge. So the challenge is, if you get all of these funding, one, do you have the necessary supports? Will the supports follow in order to administer those funds? That's not clear. That's not clear that those funds will go to the states in order to administer the funding. So could it be an unfunded mandate, meaning get the funds, you have to use the infrastructure that you currently have with no additional support? Then it becomes challenging.
Right.
Because then states have to absorb the cost in order to effectively administer and oversight that money. If we don't have Office of General Counsel, if we don't have Office of Civil Rights, and those duties go to the states with no additional support to administer those funds, then it becomes an increased burden on the states.
Now, I get that point, and I'm sympathetic. As opposed to that, Katie Jenner last week from Indiana said, who was fantastic. She said, we love the federal money, but we don't like the federal compliance stuff. Like 80% of our administrative work is filling out forms about how we're spending federal dollars. And
Mhm.
we'd love more flexibility. So how do you balance these things, Elson? And
Yeah.
you can wear both your hats at the same time. How do you balance
Abs-
things?
Absolutely. I mean, I am definitely one for flexibility. Was actually a part of a task force, a White House task force that helped develop flexibilities. There's a program called the Performance Partnership Pilot,
Mhm.
where we ask folks, meaning states and districts and localities, what flexibilities do you need
Mhm.
in order to effectively run your program?
Yeah.
What's very interesting about running that program, which has been in existence for 10 years across multiple administrations, is that oftentimes states don't realize they have more flexibilities than they do. So what that means is oftentimes the flexibilities are there, but they aren't exercising them.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the challenge is getting folks to understand that there are flexibilities, there are waivers that are available.
Yeah.
They may not just clearly understand how to use them to more effectively run their program.
Yeah, I mean, we both know this, that there's a dynamic is built up where it's scary to use those flexibilities. The easiest thing is
Yes,
there's this
it
compliance
is.
mindset on both sides. There's a lot of stuff going on. And just the easier thing to do is, paint inside the lines. Even
Right.
if it makes the use of funds less effective.
Mhm.
Elson, I want to ask you one last question.
Okay.
States have, this is not the first time that states will face significant changes in federal policy direction. And
Mhm.
everybody's described them, whether it's the stuff with kids with special needs, or it's No Child Left Behind, or it's, Race to the Top, or it's, all these things cause changes. So what have you seen around states doing a good job in retaining critical student supports and continuing to move forward even as there's a whole bunch of stuff going on at the federal level? What do we learn from that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think um, we've seen red, blue, purple states that are out there that are attempting to utilize the structures that they have to push the envelope.
Mhm.
So let's say, for instance, around I don't know, let's say around funding, Virginia has actually been pretty good around funding their funding formulas,
Mhm. Mhm.
and as a result, they've been successful in a new funding formula for their formula funding at the state level. We've seen Maryland with Governor Wes Moore obviously making changes to the Maryland blueprint, but I think even more importantly, with this Enough Act,
Mhm.
creating a grant program that is comprehensive and it targets the needs of specific communities. I think those states that are able to craft within their framework for the needs of specific populations and communities, they've been successful. And
Yeah.
so, particularly utilizing evidence-based practices. And I think that is something that folks will have to start considering. How do you use the existing funding or new funding in a way that utilizes evidence-based practice that, of course, produces the necessary return of investment of the federal dollar?
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Elson. I would love to invite everybody back on screen, and we're going to do the full Hollywood Squares thing here. And really appreciate your patience as we went through all that. We have a question. that was posted, and I'd love to go sort of across all of you or each of the areas. Not everybody's got to speak if you don't want to, but the impact of the proposed changes, particularly on rural communities. Is there a more profound impact on less resourced communities? Elson, you want to kick that off, and then we'll pop around.
Yeah, I alluded to the challenges for rural communities, particularly with things like the rails and the comprehensive centers going away. And so how do we make sure that those rural and under-resourced communities obtain the necessary technical assistance and support? It's going to be challenging without those types of resources that are available.
Okay. Okay. So that's where these regional labs become especially important, you're saying.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Amalia, we know that there are a lot of folks, English language learners in less densely populated parts of the United States. So I'm curious what you think the changes might mean in those rural communities.
Yeah, for sure. When you look at the states with the fastest growing English learner population, many of these are states that you might not think of, right?
Yeah.
In the South, right? Arkansas, Tennessee, the Carolinas. And these are states that in the past, may not have state staff with as much deep expertise, right? Or experience in terms of being able to administer programs and grants that support English learners, which is why being able to have staff at the U.S. Department of Education to provide guidance, right, support resources on the Title III program, for example, is so essential. And the recent changes that we've seen in the last couple of weeks with the Office of English Language Acquisition at the U.S. Department of Ed being essentially abolished, and moving the administration of the English language acquisition grants from OELA, which currently administered those grants and has staff with that deep expertise. There are plans to move that over to the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education Office, which has many more programs to administer. So that is definitely going to cause a disruption in the ability of the federal government to be able to support states with their EL learner populations.
Gotcha. Lindsay, how do you think about this question about rural communities with respect to kids with special needs?
Yeah, in two ways. One, to play off what Elson was saying, there's a component of IDEA, it's called Part D, and it funds technical assistance centers. And especially in some of our rural communities, we have a hard time accessing specialized expertise that is often needed for complex cases and different students. And so those technical assistance centers are still funded and they're still working. But the idea that there'd be a disruption very much mirrors what we've seen with comprehensive centers. They're providing capacity building for the states. The second is simply that teacher shortage issue, right to Amalia's point about expertise. Our rural communities need all communities need expertise, and we have teacher shortages everywhere. But we really see that in our rural communities. And there's a lot that the Department of Education is doing to provide and support that capacity that we believe is important and needs to continue.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Thanks. Denise, you have a thought on this also?
I mean, rural communities, much like urban communities, are seriously under-resourced. Title I helps them. There's a rural education program that helps them. And, I'm just like Lindsay and Elson and Amaya, very concerned that without a federal intention, a federal focus on these communities, um, you know, the governors can pick and choose who they want to send money to if these dollars are moved into some sort of block grant. Governors get, I've seen some block grant legislative language that said, and other education things, so to speak, like, you know, which,
Thank
yeah, things which could mean, the governor has the discretion to, um, use it for anything he considers education. And it might necessarily not be what we consider education as education stakeholders. So, yeah, all of that is, there was a reason why Congress did it, and it was because it was necessary and critical.
So let me stick with you for a second here, Denise, because I think you were ooching up to something that's really central. You went back to 1867, and you said essentially the federal engagement with education has really been about civil rights. And one of the key offices inside the department has been the Office of Civil Rights. So one could actually imagine a world in which really a lot of stuff, even more, was sent out to the states, but there was a very vigorous Office of Civil Rights. There was the kind of support that Elson was talking about. There's a vigorous Office of Civil Rights providing guidance, support, and also some level of accountability. Talk to us about what we understand is going on with the Office of Civil Rights. And then I want to pop around and talk about what this means for EL students and for kids with special needs as well.
Yeah, so technically we know that regional offices have been mostly eliminated, and these are your lawyers that are supporting families, providing technical assistance to school districts, making sure families with a student with disabilities has access and gets the due process that they need across the country.
Yeah.
So that loss and that expertise around education, which I do not believe that the Department of Justice has, I think is devastating. Let's also think about the tremendous work that has gone on in the Office of Civil Rights for numerous years about making sure that students have access to high quality education, making sure that all students are seen, and and relying on data to make that true. So very, very deeply concerned about the loss of expertise and that impact on families across this country. And also deeply concerned that with an administration that calls DEI discriminatory ideological something. I can't remember what the
Oh, we can't remember the E. Yeah.
yeah, can't remember the E. It's a weaponization of OCR in terms of, and it's already begun,
Yeah.
already begun, using it for their purposes as opposed to the civil rights of all students.
Gotcha. Bob, talk a little bit about the Office of Civil Rights and students with special needs.
So in some years, up to half of the complaints to the Office of Civil Rights are related to kids with disabilities. So it's a very substantial resource to families of children with disabilities. And I'll echo what Denise said. The expertise there and the expertise in the legal community that focuses there is really substantial. And has been, hard earned over the last 50 years. So, like with everything else, John, we've heard the term guardrails a lot, and that's maybe the biggest concern here with OCR and with everything else is what we're not really seeing evidence of yet. Is attention to what these guardrails will look like. We're seeing kind of sweeping changes, proclamations, eliminations, that sort of stuff. without a lot of evidence around thought and planning going into what will actually happen as a result. Because again, like we're not just going to eliminate the Office of Civil Rights. We're not just going to eliminate IDEA. We're not just going to eliminate all these things because the executive doesn't have the authority to do that. So what kind of planning is going to happen? And my concern, I'll put it here now, just in case I don't get a chance to talk again. But my real concern, John, is there are kids now, right? So these are sweeping changes, and they're going to be litigated for years, and they're going to be policy advocated for years. And yeah, we've got to get the coalitions back together that got PL 94-142 done in 1975, right? And it's really, really great to see this group on this call, this group of panelists, because we come from those areas. So, you know, all of the civil rights organizations, the disability advocates, the educational advocates, the family rights advocates, the children and families advocates, like that, those are the people that need to jump back in now. That's why I'm here. I'm at the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, but my heart is with this work, right? And so that's why I'm back on this panel. Is time for everyone to get out of your chairs and jump back in. But it's those guardrails, John. We need the guardrails, and we need to know what they're going to be.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Bob. Leslie, I want to hear from you about this question with respect to EL students.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important question. As of February 2025, just last month, there were 124 open OCR cases related to EL-related violations across the country. This is elementary, secondary, and post-secondary schools. And over the years, the Department of Justice has investigated and settled countless cases on behalf of English learners and their families. Just this week, it was reported that a civil rights complaint was filed in a school district in southern Delaware for failing to provide the required educational support for English learners. And so, settled and pending cases show that despite the fact that EL rights and protections are embedded into our legal fabric, these frameworks are only as strong as the enforcement and oversight mechanisms that are built alongside them. And the Office of Civil Rights truly plays a backstop role for students and families across the country whose rights are being violated. And, I have the number here too about how many staff were cut from OCR, and it was 243. So yeah, it's decimated, and it's going to have a real impact on students and families having recourse when their rights are being violated.
Thank you so much. So listen, we're coming in for a landing soon. I have a couple more questions, and I want to move through them quickly. We have questions around advocacy, and each of you actually suggested advocacy in your recent comments. What to do, and I would say what to do, advocating for how things are organized at the federal government level is not very interesting, and it's not very activating for people. But organizing around what happens to kids, which is why we have this focus on the young people themselves and their families. Let's have a quick round of what do you think folks ought to do, not arguing whether there should or shouldn't be a Department of Education, but to make sure that the kids who you think about the most get the resources and the protections that they need. Lindsay, let's start with you.
Sure. I think absolutely this is a time for local advocacy and local voices like we've never seen, solely because of some of what Bob said. We don't know what's going to happen in these cases, and we've got to I hate to say this actually to parents of students with disabilities, because I think too often they are the only backstop for their children, and we put a great burden on them in that sense. But I will say, I think it's important to be informed, talk with your local school. How will they spend the funds that are coming down? Are they putting in place evidence-based practices like those that we've seen that Elson, that we've talked about? Are they looking at things like universal design for learning, right? Frameworks and approaches to inclusion, to finding supports and strengths for all students? That's going to have to be where they need to show up at this moment, because that is where the main potential for their advocacy is going to live. It's at least one spot.
Really, really, really good point. Amalia, what's your thought on the advocacy that's called for right now?
Yeah, for sure. Advocacy with respect to Congress for their actions or lack of inactions, right? Because, for example, the Office of English Language Acquisition was established under statute through Congress. And so Congress does have a responsibility to protect its role and functions. Parents are going to have little recourse without an Office of Civil Rights to be able to file complaints of alleged discrimination. What are they supposed to do now in case that they have a child or student who may be discriminated against without having attorneys and investigators at the Office of Civil Rights? So, I encourage, folks to know who their Congress member is and to share their stories, right? Share their stories about what the impacts on their families for their child, what they're experiencing, are going to be with respect to these policies that are happening.
Helpful. Denise, you've been inside, you've been outside of these kind of things. Curious what you think. Again, centering the kids, not the federal structure, as Amalia just suggested. What are you thinking about it? People should, in our network, our network of local activists. What do you think people should be thinking about and talking about?
I double down on story collection and overwhelm your member of Congress with those stories of impact. The other thing that I'll share with you all is EdTrust does have, we put a toolkit on our website to how to engage. We have letters you can send to your members of Congress. We have impact on states in terms of dollars lost by program, higher ed as well as K-12, what that impact will be on your states. Those tools are open for everybody. Really invite you to take a good look at them and let me know if you need what else you need. We're honestly doing hoping to really be able to get our advocates on the ground in states, advocating at the state level to build protections should things fall away, but also advocate at the federal level to make sure members of Congress know they need to do their jobs.
Elson, I want to start with you with the last question, but then I want to do a quick runaround with this. This is a lightning round question. There is one way of talking about this that, oh my God, this is all terrible. This is going to be a disaster. But I don't think it fully recognizes the extent to which people are frustrated with the way things have been. It's been what now, 60 years since we passed ESEA. And all of us know the narrative. Like, we poured trillions of dollars into this. It's not getting much better. So, why shouldn't we try something different? So I'd love for each of you to say a little bit about what you think the narrative is around the true beneficial impact, not the absence of bad, but the beneficial impact of the federal investment and the federal role in education, because I think that we're losing that argument. That's why all this is happening, because we're losing that argument. So Elson, you kick us off, and everybody else, I'm going to come to you, but it's the lightning round. Remember, you get 30 to 45 seconds to solve this enormous problem that we could spend a whole webinar on.
I mean, I think we're at you know, I kid about this all the time. We're kind of at this Hamilton moment where we can use this as an opportunity to reset in a real way. Because in order to do the things that the administration wants to do, there will probably have to be some reauthorization, and there will have to be an opportunity for the public to be engaged. Yes, there have been a number of executive orders, but in order to make the changes, the voice of the people have to be involved. And so I do think it's important to go into this with ideas on what could the new framework around formula funding, what could the new framework around engaging evidence-based practices be in a different environment. We know that the difference is coming, but how do we position ourselves to be a part of the conversation rather than on the receiving end at the end of the table?
Gotcha. Fantastic. I'm just going to pop around. Leslie, narrative, positive narrative here.
Yeah, I mean, the current state of EL education is not perfect by any means, but Title III and the protections for English learners in Title I, they exist to ensure that English learners, regardless of where they go to school, where they live, have access to research-informed educational services, and that their teachers have someone to turn to when they have questions about how to best serve these students. And we can't abandon this goal. And so to what Elsa just said, I think we identify that there are a lot of things that can be fixed. And I think that we need to be putting those solutions and ideas on the table when it comes to English learners as well.
Awesome. Bob?
I'll go a different direction, John. I think your premise was wrong. The last 50 years for kids with disabilities has been outstanding. It's come a long way. The money's been well spent. There's always more we can do. Where the locus of the funding is less important. Stay this course at the state level and we'll do just as well. So absolutely.
Fantastic, Bob. Amalia?
Yeah, I mean, I do hope that this is an opportunity, for states to elevate their recognition of English learners and the assets that they bring to the learning environments that benefit all students, right? Because as we continue to see the population of English learners grow, and as Leslie said, most of these students were born here in the US and are US citizens. Yes, a handful of them are immigrant students, but recognizing the talent that we have grown here at home, and really invest in these students to be able to see them through their education journeys and, being able to access post-secondary education and, go through economic mobility. That's something that I would like to see the states be able to step up to that challenge.
It's fantastic. Denise, I'm coming to you in 1 second, but first we're going to stop by Lindsay's house and get her answer, and then you get to land the plane.
Well, I mean, I would agree with Bob that I think we've seen great progress for students with disabilities, and that is the result of parent advocacy that passed the law in 1975 that gave students and parents the rights they need. I would call on parents, students, educators, advocates again, be engaged, take that progress and let's take it a step further. We want our kids to have better access to high expectations. And that'd be my one criticism, right? Which really is just about evolution. It's about, can they meet the standards? We all work together. You don't work in a workplace where the people with dyslexia go in the room in the back. So I think let's have that holistic vision for all of the way that we move. And we can do that if we rebuild in the right way.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Denise, you started us off so brilliantly, so I'm going to let you have the last word here. And I want to add one thing to the question for you, because we have a question around who also are your colleagues in the world of advocacy, who people ought to be aware of, other organizations that are really providing great resources and great leadership. So your answer on narrative, who else should we be looking to? And then I'll close us out.
Look, in terms of narrative, let's be clear. We're not about protecting the status quo. We do need big and bold vision if we are going to do, as Lindsay suggested, always hate following her because she says all the right things. If we want our kids to all be taught and access the highest standards, we're going to need some big and bold ideas. But look, some of them are already out there and we just need to make them happen. All of them that I would reference have some evidence base to them, such as high impact tutoring, such as strategic staffing models, such as is it equally important, how do you make kids feel included in a sense of belonging so they want to be at school?
Yep.
Going after chronic absenteeism. So I'll put all those out there. There's many more, but we need bold new vision, and there are people out there that have that, many of whom I'd say the 210 folks left. I saw a high of nearly 400.
Yeah.
You all have a lot of the answers, and we at Trust would love to hear them and work with you on them. And then last, in terms of other organizations, National Parents Union, huge fan. I'm absolutely a fan of Unidos. NAACP at the local level doing great work. National Urban League also doing great work. I just saw a piece today from Ann Heislop, who works at the Alliance for Excellence in Education, also a great place. But there's also state folks too. So, you know, happy to direct you to them as well. But thanks, John. This has been so great. Love being on this panel.
Thank you so much, Denise. Thank you, everybody. That was a spectacular panel. It was so informative, so interesting and lively. You all were fantastic. So thanks to you all for joining. Thanks to Sarah and to Hillary and to Leah, everybody who helps put this thing together. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Come back next week to hear about immigrant families. And with that, I wish you a good day and a good afternoon. And thanks again. So long.